70 kilometers from this point, but now we know that even at a very early stage the boundaries of the Kingdom of Kush were much more extensive than hitherto thought, and there's every possibility of finding more sites of this period further upstream in the areas not yet surveyed. It just shows that whenever you see a gap in the archaeological map of Sudan, particularly along the Nile Valley, it's simply a gap in archaeological work, not a gap in human occupation in the past.
Travelling in northern Sudan is always an expedition, but this region is particularly hostile. Driving the discoveries in the Fourth Cataract is the construction of a dam that will flood over 100 miles of one of Sudan's most beautiful landscapes, with its tumbling rapids and many small islands. It will also wipe out 150,000 years of human occupation. Pavel Wolf and his team are just one group, racing against time to record historic sites before they're flooded. But they can only provide footnotes to what should be an important chapter in Kush's story.
I think it's the most fantastic landscape I ever seen. For working, it's of course difficult, since most of the places are reachable only by foot. To reach the farther sides on the bigger islands, we have to walk, scrambling around up and down the hills for about 15 kilometers a day.
With such a vast area to cover, the team can only spend a short time at each site.
Within the first 2 to 3 weeks, we have about 100 to 120 sites discovered here, which were completely unknown. We find sites every 20 meters, more or less. Sometimes you even don't know where a site ends and where the next site begins. Judging from the sites we found, we can really say that over the centuries it was probably much more populated than it is today.
Sudan's landscape is littered with graves and cemeteries. Far harder to find are the settlements.
The best places near the river are of course still inhabited, and these are the places of the modern villages. We cannot excavate them now because they are still inhabited. After they will be left because of the flooding, there won't be the time to excavate them. What we are doing here is the last step. It's the first and the last step.
Kush occupied some 650 miles of the Nile Valley, its area of control rivaling Egypt's. Even today, getting directly from Kush's southern borders to its northern frontier is a 2-day journey. There's no tarmac, just 200 miles of unremitting desert.
Places look very close together on the map, but you've really got to work hard to get from one to another. I've been coming here for 22 years now. Usually 3 months over the winter when the climate in UK is freezing cold, so it's a good time to follow the birds down to Africa. And everyone's looking for the best route, and there's no best route, so people are just wandering all over the place. On these tracks, or on these total absence of tracks, there's no signs telling you a sharp bend or a pothole or whatever. Anything can happen at any moment. You've got to be aware all the time how careful you need to be.
We know from Egyptian records that Kush's northern frontier capital at Sai Island was the gateway for trade between the two great powers. But only one clue remains for the great metropolis that once stood here.
The main evidence we have for that comes from this cemetery over in the distance here. It's a very large cemetery dominated by some really massive tumuli, burials of very important individuals.
In a land where so much physical evidence of their civilization has turned to dust, cemeteries show us the real wealth and power wielded by the Kushites. The cemetery at Kerma was in use for over 1,000 years. At over half a square mile, its scale is awesome.
It is one of the most important cemeteries in antique time. It is enormous, with maybe 30,000 graves.
Here the kings of Kush were buried in massive tumuli 100 yards across and capped by conical blocks of white marble. The kings' bodies rested in the cemetery's huge funerary temples before being carried out along the processional way for burial. Like the pharaohs, Kushite kings took their wealth to their graves. And plenty of companions too.
When Reisner came here, he found in this passage a lot of sacrificed bodies. Reisner was thinking that it was some Negroes or slaves, but recent anthropological studies show us that it was maybe of the same family of the king.
Whether these people went to their deaths willingly remains a mystery. There's no forensic evidence to show they were executed. They seem to have just laid down and awaited a slow death as sand was piled over them.
Reisner found many statues and pieces of statue. One was extraordinary, it is Senuit.
This statue of an Egyptian noblewoman was just one of the many Egyptian grave goods Reisner found in 1916. He believed such valuable objects could only belong to Egyptians, and never considered that black Africans might have taken them from Egypt by force. Reisner should have asked himself why Egypt troubled to build a string of massive fortresses on its southern frontier. The guidebooks tell you these forts have all been swallowed up by Lake Nasser after the building of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s. But Derek Welsby decided to check this out for himself at Uranati. And Uranati still has its defenders.
Getting over here was a bit tricky, but it's great to be here. I don't think anyone else has been here, any archaeologists, for the last 30 odd years or more. It was marvellous. I always regretted the fact that I was born too late to see these sites that were flooded by Lake Nasser, but it's great that there's some of them still here. People have always wondered, why the Egyptians needed to build such massive fortifications at the same time as they're always talking about the people beyond the frontier as miserable Kush, wretched Kush. I mean, this really shows how frightened the Egyptians were of these people. These are some of the most impressive fortifications dating from the ancient world.
Around the mid-17th century BC, Egypt pulled out and the Kushite army took control of the forts. But this was no friendly changing of the guard. There had been a seismic shift in the balance of power between the two rivals. In 1650 BC, mighty Egypt was on its knees. Its pharaoh had lost control of Lower Egypt, and from the south, Kush was about to invade. The rest is history, or it is now, thanks to Vivian Davis's discovery at El Kab. He has found the missing link between what archaeology can only guess at and recorded fact. El Kab was an important Egyptian city, and its governor Sobek Nacht was keen to leave his spin on a defeat Egypt never acknowledged.
Here we're fortunate that what Sobek Nacht wants to tell us about is concerned with something very special, a great historical event that we otherwise might not have learnt about. He's keen to tell us because he himself played a heroic role in the defence of his own town. The inscription tells us that he repaired the rampart, prepared the soldiery, and defended the town valiantly. And he goes on to say, vile Kush came. This force was enormous. It was unprecedented in size, and it covered the desert right up to the southern point of the Egyptian delta. So what we have here for the first time is an indication that the kingdom of Kush swept into Egypt right through, and as we think now, took back to Kerma, its capital, an enormous amount of loot. This loot was buried with the kings of Kush as symbols of their domination over Egypt, over the Egyptian kings.
Kush rampaged through Egypt on the smash and grab. With its saddlebags bulging with loot, the Kushite army headed home, and fatally gave Egypt time to recover. Egypt eventually struck back, and took Kush's trading capital at Sai Island, opening up the frontier. The balance of power had swung Egypt's way. And now its pharaoh, Thutmose I, was hell-bent on making Kush pay the price of daring to humiliate Egypt.